So my name is Annika Todd, and I just want to welcome you guys to the third in our ongoing series titled Uses for Smart Meter Data. So in our first two webinars, we described a series of ever more complex analytical techniques that utilities could apply to the smart meter data in order to learn more about their customers and how they impact the grid. In addition, we illustrated that such activities could enable utilities to identify which customers might be good candidates for certain rate or program offerings, and which customers might want to avoid such opportunities, or which customers might need just a little more dedicated and targeted education and outreach to increase their likelihood of success. So today, PCAPers will present a very tangible and practical example of how these techniques can actually be applied to existing rate or program experiences. He will show how, through such an analysis, a utility could sort of gain a much richer understanding of which customers are doing what, and how to actually use that information to improve future program design and implementation. And although this webinar is the third and sort of expands upon some of the themes in our first two that we previously discussed, the presentations are largely independent, so it's not really a big deal if you missed the last one or fell asleep halfway through it or were checking email or whatever it is. If you want to see what you missed, which was probably really awesome, you can find both a recording of those webinars and the slide decks themselves on our website, and a link is going to be provided in the chat box shortly. And then before Pete kicks things off, we really want to thank the Department of Energy for their financial support of this webinar series, because if we didn't have that, we wouldn't actually be able to make this happen, and you guys would not be able to listen to our charming voices. So. And then in addition, the way that questions and answers will work is that after the webinar, we will answer all questions, and I think you can raise your hand, or no, I think you can't raise your hand. I think you have to send a question to the chat box, and then I will be gathering all of the questions, and we will answer them at the end rather than midway through, and we'll try to answer most of them that we can. That's it for my introductory remarks. So Pete, on to you.
All right, thanks, Annika. Okay, so as we previously discussed in the two webinars before, there's a huge variety in load patterns across customers. And we know this from AMI data that's been collected over time. And we see this even among customers with otherwise similar attributes. For example, customers who self-identify as owning things like central air conditioning may or may not actually use it, or they may use it in very, very different ways. And so if we meaningfully want to segment customers based on distinct energy personalities, it's not really enough to just know who owns what. Instead, we really need to focus on observed electricity consumption patterns if we want to make order of this chaos and find some degree of commonness in this sea of diversity, as you see on this graphic. So in our last webinar, we identified 5 characteristics that were important for segmenting residential customers into groups that were significantly, and when I say significantly, I mean statistically significantly different from each other. The first characteristic you see listed here has to do with a customer's base load usage, which we've defined as the daily minimum electricity consumption level. The second and third characteristics focused on total average electricity consumption during different periods of the day, either the 2 hours prior to the peak period or the peak period itself. The fourth and fifth characteristic looked at variability in consumption, but over time. In particular, how a customer's load shape itself actually varied from day to day, as well as how their average usage in the 2 hours just after the peak period changed on a daily basis. When we use these 5 characteristics, you can actually segment a sample of residential customers using them. With the 9 ensuing customer groups that we created from a sample data set of customer load data, we are actually able to derive a 6th characteristic seen at the bottom of this graphic. This final one quantified the bill impacts associated with taking service under a time of use rate in this instance, instead of the customer's otherwise applicable default tariff rate. To do this, we use historical smart meter data applied against these 2 alternative rate designs. And this calculation assumes no response is undertaken by the customer vis-a-vis this new TOU rate we're hypothesizing they join. And so we would expect this structural winningness characteristic is calculated is going to potentially understate the true bill impacts associated with moving to a time of use rate, because we believe that in moving to that type of a rate, at least some customers are going to change their consumption patterns away from the higher priced on-peak rate towards the lower priced off-peak rate. What we showed previously is then we can take those various 9 characteristics and illustrate how they differ between those various, the 6 characteristics, 7 characteristics relative to the 9 customer groups that we formed. And what this allows us to do is identify who might be good, better, or even the best candidates for target marketing a particular rate or program to, and which customers a utility might want to, not want to spend as much time vigorously recruiting. For example, a utility might want to vigorously target market their TOU rate to customers in Group I on the far right. They have the highest degree of savings potential by way of peak and pre-peak period usage levels and the largest share of structural winners. These customers also are highly stable in their usage patterns, as well as peak period consumption. And this suggests that they may have some very set routines. Now, some routines are easier than others to alter. For example, it may not be that difficult to, let's say, run a dishwasher before heading up to bed rather than doing it right after dinner. But it might be a lot more challenging to push, say, clothes washing until later at night. I don't know about you, but I really don't want to be waiting up for the dryer to finish up so I can fold some clothes. So if these customers are able to adjust those routines, even in somewhat small fashions, those can be simply and effectively modified to take advantage of this TOU rate. And if that's the case, then a utility has even more reason to aggressively market their TOU rate to households in this particular group. Alternatively, we can see that folks in customer group A have some of the lowest savings potential among the customer groups, as evidenced by more modest peak, pre-peak, and baseload usage levels. In addition, customers in this group don't immediately see bill savings from transitioning to the TOU rate, so they would need to alter their consumption patterns in some fashion to ultimately see a lower bill. However, the high degree of variability in both their daily load patterns as well as post-peak period consumption levels suggest that these customers have little to no set routines. Now, because of that, customers may actually find it difficult to make the necessary changes to their consumption patterns on a consistent basis in order to see some financial gain from transitioning to this TOU rate. Accordingly, this might really limit their interest and ability to adapt to the TOU rate. When taken all together, a utility might ultimately decide to either flat out avoid marketing to these customers or at least do so in a much less vigorous way. And that basically gets you up to speed to where we left off last time. Now, unfortunately, the previous analysis that we presented in the prior 2 webinars was predicated on our assessment of which customers and their associated characteristics might make them good or bad candidates for some utility offering. Let's say like an electric vehicle charging program, an air conditioning direct load control program, a critical peak rebate, or the example we've been working with so far, a time of use rate. However, we haven't really ground-truthed any of these assumptions, and you probably know what happens when you assume, right? It makes anyway, you get the point. So what we should do next is actually field test these assumptions on actual customers who are participating in some existing utility rate or program. Doing so would allow us to better understand how customers in these different groups actually varied in things like their enrollment or their attrition in the program, or even their load response to the offered rate or program. And now with this information in hand, a utility could better understand if some of the defined characteristics that we've identified are highly correlated with high or low enrollment, or appear to support or hinder customer response. And such an analysis would also help test some a priori expectations about the types of customers who join a rate or participate in a program offering, how long they might stick around, and how well or poorly they perform. Many of these assumptions have never been meaningfully tested. So to us, as researchers, this creates a great opportunity to validate or refute some of that popular wisdom. And so today we're going to show you what happened when we applied this approach to smart meter data collected as part of the Sacramento Municipal Utility District's Smart Pricing Options Study. Specifically, we focused on customers who participated in SMUD's voluntary TOU rate offering. In the slides that follow, we're going to show you how this previously defined 9 customer groups, again, those are the heat maps you saw earlier, how those customer groups differed by enrollment, response, and even on a cost per kWh of saved energy under a time of use rate. So to start with, let's compare the enrollment rates shown on the x-axis in this graph from each group across their average, relative to their average load response during the peak period to the time of use TOU rate, which is depicted on the y-axis. Now, it's important to understand when we talk about enrollment here, we're actually focusing on an enrollment probability. Because what we have are customers, both those exposed to the TOU rate and those who weren't, and we group those customers according to the characteristics you saw before. And that gives us an opportunity to model what customers in that group, the preferences the customers in that group have for time of use, relative to the default inclining block rate tariff that they were on. Now with respect to load response, we're able to take those 2 subsets of customers and compare them against each other to estimate average hourly energy savings during the peak period, again, for each of our different customer groups. So with these important pieces of information about the rate experience in hand, we can perform an analysis to challenge or affirm some a priori expectations about enrollment vis-a-vis response. So for example, many people think that a household who is more likely to enroll in a TOU rate also reduces more electricity during the peak period. So this suggests a positive relationship, which is shown as a dashed line in the graph. The conventional wisdom being that if a customer knows enough about their own consumption patterns to readily take service under a TOU rate, they will likely understand their capabilities to respond to it and are thus able to successfully execute those actions. Conversely, those customers who are reticent to join either maybe don't know as much about their own capabilities or know just enough to appreciate that they might be challenged responding to that rate. This suggests a positive relationship might exist between enrollment and performance. Now, when we perform an analysis to derive enrollment probabilities and estimate response levels for each customer group, we see the exact opposite situation occurs. In actuality, households and groups who are more likely to enroll in TOU actually save less energy during the peak period than those who are less likely to enroll. And those who are most likely to enroll provide the least amount of peak period energy savings. Such a finding flies really in the face of these a priori expectations. With this more accurate and complete assessment of enrollment and response, a utility could better anticipate or predict which households, say, might be the most and least likely to enroll in a TOU rate, as well as what their expected level of response to that rate would be. This really can help utilities in program planning efforts, at least in terms of setting more reasonable enrollment and load response targets, as well as potentially increasing the likelihood of meeting those goals. Segmentation analysis, segmentation analysis also allows us to identify those households who will automatically see lower bills from taking service under a TOU rate. Using our previously discussed structural winningness characteristics associated with each of the 9 customer groups, we can compare and contrast enrollment and response levels. Now, many people believe that structural winners deliver little, if any, peak load reductions, but are highly likely to enroll given the financial benefits that result. So, if we think that structural winners have high enrollment probabilities but lower response than their counterparts, that would mean they would be in this quadrant highlighted in blue. But what do you think? Are they actually in that quadrant? No. In fact, the opposite is true. These structural winner households that automatically get lower bills were actually some of the least likely to enroll. But perhaps even more surprisingly, when they did enroll, they delivered the highest peak period energy savings. If a utility can readily identify these structural winners based on load shapes and a simple billing analysis, then future offerings can actually target these customers for recruitment. This amounts to a win-win-win. First, these participating customers see lower bills, not just by taking service under the TOU rate, but by actually responding to it. Second, the system benefits from lower peak energy and demand levels associated with the response by these structural winners. And third, the utility could see lower costs due to reduced peak energy and demand levels, not just an erosion in their collected revenues, which is commonly the concern with these types of customers. So if the customers, these customers highlighted on the graph who were the most likely to enroll but the least likely to provide much load response weren't structural winners. You might be asking yourself, who are these mysterious households? Well, these high enrollers and low responders, it turns out that they were actually households that had flexible energy schedules with a large share of energy use in the peak period, which appears to be discretionary. These customers look like they were capable of responding to the rate, but in actuality, largely did not. One reason could be that they simply didn't know what changes they could undertake to reduce peak period electricity consumption or fully understand the value in pursuing such actions. So a utility could provide these customers with more marketing or education material tailored to convey very specific tips and tricks on how they can respond to the TOU rate and quantify the impact of doing so. Given how many of them are taking service under the rate, even a modest increase in the average response level would have a pretty large aggregate impact due to sort of the multiplier effect. Now, it's also possible to develop supply curves from the different customer cluster groups based on enrollment cost data as well as customer group specific enrollment and response estimates. Now, for those of you whose eyes glaze over at the idea of supply, what we're talking about here is a curve that shows the cost of getting 1 extra kWh reduction in peak electricity out of these customers. So such supply curves can be useful for identifying which customers groups a utility might want to pursue first, and which groups should possibly be avoided or may just need more engagement and education in order to become more cost effective. So, for example, the 2 groups at the bottom of the supply curve provide the cheapest kWh reduction, roughly 20 cents per kilowatt hour for Group H and about 30 cents per kilowatt hour for Group I. Now, as we discussed earlier, H and I are predominantly comprised of structural winners. These are the ones who are less likely to enroll in a TOU rate, but when they do, they provide substantial peak period energy reductions. The end result is some of the most cost-effective customers to recruit into a TOU rate. But if you look at the width of the bars along the x-axis, it shows the total amount of kWh reduced from the entire group. And H and I provide much, much smaller aggregate reductions than a number of the other groups. And this is because there are just so few of these households that actually enroll. And so as previously discussed, if you can target market to these customers who look like have those characteristics that are that dominate this group H and I, then the total system can really benefit from this rate, and the system can benefit from the impacts that they provide. On the other hand, groups A, B, and C, which again we saw earlier, are customers who have limited flexibility and have a higher likelihood of enrolling but produce pretty small amounts of individual load response. So accordingly, they are some of that produce some of the highest cost of saved peak period electricity of all of our groups. They're at the far right of the supply curve. A utility would need to decide if money spent on targeted education or outreach to try and increase the response of customers in these groups is really worth the expenditure. Because clearly most utilities have fixed budgets, fixed marketing budgets, and so you ultimately need to decide where to spend it. So in this case, you could either, like we said, focus on increasing the money spent to market to these customers to make them better responders, or alternatively, spend the money potentially on getting more customers, let's say, from H and I on board. So clearly this type of a supply curve really makes it a lot easier for utilities and program administrators to assess where they should be spending those limited dollars that they have. And so ultimately, in using this type of supply curve, it should help make such rate and program offerings more successful, but also hopefully more cost effective. So utilities have, in summary, utilities have an ample opportunity to analyze their smart meter data in order to learn more about their customers and how they impact the grid by using existing rate and program experience. They can better understand who are good candidates for increased marketing and outreach efforts potentially, as well as which customers should be avoided or have more dedicated targeted education and outreach to increase their likelihood. And you can use these supply curves to just be a lot more thoughtful and effective and efficient in who you market to. Obviously, the analysis of smart meter data has a host of other applications. We hope this webinar stirs some interest in pursuing these, as well as other analytical activities in the pursuit of increased efficiency with this incredibly rich data set that utilities with AMI have in-house.